Welcome to this reading. This is Professor Smith, and I will be recording the book After Polygamy Was Made a Sin, The Social History of Christian Polygamy by John Cairncross. Polygamy was forbidden after Roman papists took over the church. Isaiah 4 tells us the Astra strongholds denying every believing woman a good husband will be overcome at the last. Enjoy, and may the Almighty Yahweh bless you. Chapter 8, When Nature Prompted, will continue now in this book. English thinking on polygamy is a fabric woven of many colors and as individualistic as the national character. Each episode is therefore dealt with separately. The only recurrent motif is a down-to-earth concern with the population and cost aspects. Abstract metaphysical speculation is conspicuously absent. Yet, between about 1680 and 1750, the campaign for polygamy was in full swing, and plural marriage was almost as vigorously canvassed as in Germany during the same period. The freethinkers were to the fore, with a sprinkling of a new kind of animal now called demographers. Religion came into the picture mainly in the form of references to the Old Testament. Example, it was only after the turn of the 18th century that clerics began to play a more prominent role, in particular Wesley Hall and Martin Maiden, both of whom had started out as disciples of John Wesley, the founder of the Wesleyan Church. The true tradition of Puritan polygamy, as exemplified by Rotman and Ochino, had one certain and one possible exponent, but they are much the most illustrious of the lot. Saints and Patriarchs. The manuscript was lengthy, Latin, abstruse, and theological. For over a century, it had gathered dust in the London Public Records Office. Yet, when it was exhumed in 1823, its discovery was a national event. King George IV personally singled out the learned Bishop Sumner to edit and translate it. 2 years later, when both the original and English versions had been published with copious annotations, the excitement swelled into an uproar. The Church of England learned, to its consternation, that the author was unorthodox to the point of rejecting the Trinity and the Sabbath. This was hard to stomach, but the stiffest medicine was his justification of Old Testament polygamy. Even in pre-Victorian days, this was too much for the most liberal mind. Reader's note here, I think where it says rejecting the Trinity and the Sabbath that they are talking about is, at that time, they literally called Sunday the Sabbath. So in reality, it's likely he was rejecting the Sunday Sabbath and opting for the biblical Sabbath, which is Saturday. So that's what I'm thinking there, because the old way of thinking, how they covered up their malfeasance in the church, is to basically say that Sunday was the Sabbath, that's the Christian Sabbath. You see, every once in a while you might run into somebody like that. But it appears that if he is looking at the law of God on its face and deducing that polygamy is allowed by the law of God, then it makes sense to suggest that when he says Sabbath, it is simply as the old style church claimed Sunday was the Sabbath. Then he rejected it, which, is not hard to see if you really study the law of God. The Trinity, however, I'm not sure what that is about. But even today, there are some Messianics who dispute the idea, the concept of the Trinity, and so on. It's not without controversy, for sure. All right, some critics simply denounced the manuscript as a fraud. Others ascribed it to the writer's carefree youth, and the more disingenuous glossed over the more disturbing aspects of the treatise, or completely ignored them. Macaulay, the statesman and essayist, went to the other extreme and suggested with a knowing wink that nobody familiar with the writer's personal life should be startled by his apology for polygamy. All these reactions were wide of the mark. The work was genuine. It was composed in the 1650s by a man well on in life who had never cohabited with several wives simultaneously and who, on the contrary, was known to be the most austere morality. But a community will usually go to any extreme rather than face unpalatable revelations about a national institution. Shakespeare's works had been repeatedly emasculated, and certain less respectable aspects of his plays ignored. The present case was not quite so grave, since the theological orthodoxy rather than bawdiness of the language was involved. Yet John Milton, for the poet in question, was the author of Paradise Lost, was lucky to have enjoyed immunity for so long. Up till 1825, few even suspected him of holding radical views. Indeed, had the manuscript of De Doctrina not been discovered, his advocacy of Old Testament polygamy would never have been known, and his views on religion would not have been subjected to such severe scrutiny. The thinking underlying De Doctrina and Paradise Lost must be basically the same, for it is much harder to tax a poem with being heretical than a former treatise. Lyser, it is true, had included Milton in his list of sympathizers, see page 84. But the reference seems to have escaped critics so far, and even if it had been brought to their notice earlier, it would probably have been dismissed as the wishful thinking of a crank. In all the poet's works designed for the public, there's only one passage explicitly alluding to polygamy. It is so discreetly phrased as to be hardly compromising. The reference was picked out by the omnivorous Summer in his edition of De Doctrina, and is to be found in Milton's History of Britain, written about 1650 and published in 1670. It contrasts the liberty, not unnatural, to have many wives, with the alleged polyandry of the ancient Britons, whom Milton denounces as much more absurd, and preposterous in their license. Readers know that's an interesting thing there. The ancient Britons, and that might include, say, the Picts and those, if you read, the early histories of Britain, there were various tribes that were very. Remember that goddess worship had a huge stranglehold on the pagan world. This is why even Israel slipped into Ashtoreth worship many times. Goddess worship is a big deal. And of course, the ancient Britons were pagan to the core before, Rome and the church had an impact on that nation. And through subjugation and war, they basically Christianized their area. Therefore, it is true, a further echo of Milton's views on Old Testament polygamy, but so carefully phrased as to be visible only to the initiated, and which indeed seems not to have been noted by the experts. This is in Paradise Lost, which, as Maurice Kelly has so brilliantly shown, was written at the same time as De Doctrina, and which, or De Doctrina, and which is in effect a theological gloss on the epic. The allusion is to be found in the well-known paean to, quote, wedded love, unquote, in Book 4, where Milton sings and praises not only of the marriage bed, but also of the nuptials. And this is, let's see, I think this is a quote here, as saints and patriarchs used, F62. A line which, read in the context of what we know now to be the poet's views, can only refer to Old Testament practice. For it is on the Old Testament, with occasional quotations from the New Testament, that Milton rests his whole case. He does, it is true, touch on the demographic implications of polygamy, contrasting it with modern practices where, in most cases, the land is suffered to remain uncultivated for want of population. But for the rest, his single, almost obsessive concern is to refute those who have charged, quote, the holy patriarchs and pillars of our faith, Abraham and others, who have more than one wife at the same time with habitual fornication and adultery, unquote. A very gross crime, readers note, that even modern churchianity makes today, and they will stand before the judgment seat and give an account for that. When they see these righteous men there, they might be cast out. It could be. For if the accusation were justified, one would be, quote, be forced to exclude from the sanctity of God, or sanctuary of God, as spurious, the holy offspring which sprang for them, yea, the whole of the sons of Israel, for whom the sanctuary itself was made, unquote. And why? Because, quote, a bastard shall not enter into the congregation of Jehovah, even to a 10th generation, unquote, Deuteronomy 32:2. And so, quote, either polygamy is a true marriage, or all children born in that state are spurious, which would include the whole race of Jacob, unquote. But Milton goes on, quote, as such an assertion would be absurd and the extreme, not to say impious, it appears to me that so far from the lawfulness of polygamy being trivial, it is of the highest importance that it should be decided, unquote. He sweeps aside as irrelevant the oft-quoted text of the twain between one flesh. The husband, he contends, can be one flesh with each of his wives, just as a father can feel paternal love for each of his children. In the same way, the poet rejects the equation of Christ banning on putting away one's wife with the prohibition of polygamy. What Christ forbids, he argues, is the repudiation of the first wife. If that is done, the husband committeth adultery against her. Mark 10:11. He must, on the contrary, continue to be responsible for her, as also for the second wife. For the husband is in a condition to perform his conjugal duties to the wife, even having taken another to her, is shown by God himself. Exodus 21:10. If he take him another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish, unquote. It cannot be supposed, Milton adds sardonically, that the divine forethought intended to provide for adultery. To clinch his argument that polygamy is allowed by the law of God, Milton cites, quote, abundant examples of men whose holiness renders them fit patterns for imitation and who are among the lights of our faith, unquote. Abraham, Gideon, Elkanah, and particularly David, who, having been established by Jehovah, king over Israel, took him more wives and concubines out of Jerusalem. Let me read that again. To clinch his argument that polygamy is allowed by the law of God, Milton cites abundant examples of men whose holiness renders them fit patterns for imitation and who are among the lights of our faith, Abraham, Gideon, Elkanah, and particularly David, who, having been established by Jehovah, king over Israel, took him more wives and concubines out of Jerusalem, unquote. Such comments, Milton, quote, were motives such the honorable and holy thoughts whereby David was influenced, namely, by the consideration of God's kindness toward him for his people's sake. His heavenly and prophetic understanding saw not what we in our blindness fancy we discern so clearly. Only in the case of Solomon does Milton admit, rather reluctantly, that the king, quote, seems to have exceeded due bounds. But even then, the poet points out that Solomon's offense consisted in having married strange women, and not that he had taken too many wives. When it comes to the New Testament, Milton is equally sure of his ground. Polygamy, he says, is prohibited to no one, even under the gospel, for that dispensation annuls none of the merely civil regulations which existed previous to its introduction. But Milton administers the coup de grace to his opponents when he observes that God himself, in Ezekiel 23, verse 4, represents himself as having espoused two wives, which would have been unthankful had, quote, the practice been intrinsically dishonorable or shameful, quote, unquote. On the contrary, he maintains polygamy is, quote, lawful and honorable. Formally speaking, Milton's looks like apologia for the patriarchs is embedded in purely theological material and falls neatly into the place against his background as an outstanding Hebrew and biblical scholar. His interest in the subject is reflected in his commonplace book, where he entered his private notes and reflections, and which, at a point which had been dated at roughly the first half of the 1640s, he reproduces the view expressed in a dialogue composed by Justin Martyr, a second century father. That among the ancient Jews, quote, polygamy was by no means forbidden because of the diverse secret rites concealed in it, unquote. Readers note, that's very interesting. I wonder what the diverse secret rites were among the Jews, those who practice polygamy. Very, very interesting. That's curious. I'd like to know more on that if somebody has that. His notes also show that he was aware of the Lutheran clergy attitude to Philip of Hesse's bigamous marriage, of the loss of the Congo to Christianity because of the Catholic priest's refusal to sanction polygamy, and of the Roman Emperor Valentinian's cancellation of the ban on polygamy in the 5th century AD. Readers note, very interesting. This is how we get the proofs that it wasn't really until the 600s, and it was reaffirmed at the Council of Trent around the 1500s, that they were clamping down on what was clearly a Christian practice that a man may marry more than one wife. This is how we know that the church has been in eternal conflict against the papists and those who basically exclaim the sola scriptura mantra, which is we should go by the Bible alone. And what the Bible shows, that is what our doctrine should show. The Papists, on the other hand, they had this view that the Pope is the ultimate authority, and it doesn't matter what he says, we have to follow it. And if what he says is in direct contradiction to Holy Writ, we still have to ignore Holy Writ and follow the Holy Father. Or they call him holy anyway. So, continuing on, formally speaking, Milton's Apologia for the Patriarchs is embedded in pure theological. I think I read that already. Let's see here. Justin Martyr, I think that's where we were. Justin Martyr, a second century father, that among the ancient Jews, polygamy was by no means forbidden because of the diverse secret rites concealed in it. His notes also show that he was aware of the Lutheran clergy's attitude to Philip of Hesse, bigamous marriage, of the loss of the Congo to Christianity. Isn't that an interesting little historical factoid? The entire Congo rejected Christianity because of the Catholic priests were basically telling these tribal chiefs, you got to get rid of all your wives. You got to give those chiefs credit. They didn't succumb to it because of the Catholic priest's refusal to sanction polygamy and of the Roman Emperor Valentinian's cancellation of the ban on polygamy in the 5th century AD. Okay, now we are where we were. However, all these references merely indicate intellectual curiosity, at most an absence of explicit hostility to polygamy. There are a far cry from the ardent defense of that institution as right and honorable in all ages, which Milton was to compose some 10 years later. In his case, as with most men, dissentient views on marriage are rarely elaborated in the midnight quietly of the study, but have their roots in a heretic's emotional life. Interesting that they should call him a heretic. Well, from the perspective of the Roman Catholic Church, which, let's be honest, the apostles would call them heretics because they have gone so far from Holy Writ. There's no indication that the apostles themselves did not regard Holy Writ as absolutely authoritative. Therefore, those who say Holy Writ is, not relevant, that's a very heretical statement. And that's what the Catholic Church maintains even to this day. Continuing on, not that Milton, as Macaulay would have us think, was demonstrably inclined to polygamy. He was thrice married, but in succession. After the death of the first and subsequent of the second wife, there is nothing particularly significant about this, except perhaps that Milton did not perhaps like living alone, and he was fond of female companionship. In fact, he never made any secret of his delight in, quote, the apt and cheerful conversation of a man with woman to comfort and refresh him, unquote. For him, the key text applicable to marital life was not, quote, increase and multiply, but it is not good for man to be alone, unquote. And he was to refer movingly to a remedy against loneliness. The trouble was that he expected too much of marriage, and that in his first essay, Assay, I think it's Assay. So, in other words, his first foray into marriage. He did not choose wisely. For one thing, he expected complete subservience on the part of the woman. In Paradise Lost, for example, the roles of Adam and Eve are clearly demarcated. And it quotes here, he for God only, she for God in him. A woman was to be kept firmly in her very subordinate place. And here's a quote. Therefore, God's universal power gave to the man despotic power over his female in due awe. And this is from a quote in the, uh, it's in the middle of the millennia, 1064 to 6. And this is Samson Agonistus. And it might be a church father. I'd have to look that up. But these are quotes from traditional church teaching, traditional church teaching, let's face it, regardless of what the outcry against the SBC today and their declaration of what has been historical Christianity all along, that only men belong to the pulpit. This was, of course, the rule of centuries of Christian teaching, that men rule over women. His attitude is to be found among the Munsterites and would seem to be constant in Puritan polygamy. But male domination is to be no means confined to polygamists. Milton was also, by a curious paradox, which was to recur throughout the Anabaptist polygamist tradition, an advocate of education for women. He was an admirer of their intellect and perceptiveness and a forerunner of the modern romantic conception of marriage. As his sympathetic portrait of the erring Eve and many other gestures makes clear, he was highly responsive to feminine charm. Adam, it has been observed, eats the apple and follows Eve out of paradise rather than lose her. Very interesting statement, reader's note. That has been my thesis all along. I never did get it from this guy, but I assumed that Adam loved Eve to such a degree he was afraid to leave her, so he was hedging his bet. That's why he took the apple bite. And I was thinking, well, surely God won't destroy both of us. So he was basically, it's like all his chips on the table now. The poet had an ardent temperament, yet even at a youth, he had made his choice and resolved, quote, to scorn delights and live laborious days. Not for him, here's another quote, to sport with Amaryllis in the shade or with the tangles of Neaera's hair. So this is a quote that seems to imply a man having two wives. His morals appear to have been blameless well into manhood. This was to be his undoing. His first marriage was in 1643. The courtship was hasty. Milton appears to have been swept off his feet by his future wife's charm and beauty. But the characters of the couple were utterly dissimilar. Milton was an austere, retiring scholar, dedicated to the Puritan cause, and he was 33, a ripe age in those days. His wife was an uneducated girl of 17, the daughter of a country squire, and a royalist at that. Readers note. Now, here is if you don't know history, you might struggle with this. But here you have the political attitudes of Milton were in adversity of the royal kinds of things they did. It would be like a Protestant marrying a bona fide, blue to the core papist woman. Okay, and it's like oil and water. It would not mix well. So he didn't do a lot of inquiry, it must be, during the courtship phase, to find out what her political inclinations were. And apparently she had some pretty serious ones at that. Continuing on, the outcome of the match was not hard to predict. Being bred into a family of plenty and freedom, says an early biographer, she, quote, was not well pleased with his reserved manner of life. After a few weeks together, and probably before the marriage was even consummated, she left him. She was to be absent for at least 2 crucial years. Isn't that something? Milton was lucid enough to realize why his marriage had failed. Quote, many who had spent their youth chastely, he wrote, quote, are in some things not so quick-sighted, while they haste so eagerly to light the marriage torch, unquote. And with remarkable open-mindedness, he added, quote, they who have lived most loosely prove most successful in their matches, unquote. Isn't that an amazing admission by Milton? He basically is saying that, say, like a young boy who's out there sleeping around with many different girls to kind of test them out, which is honestly what's happening today. uh, that they gain a certain amount of wisdom from that, and they then, when it comes time to choose the one girl that they want to stay with, uh, they seem to have a much more they seem to have much more successful marriage compared to the very naive young man who was a virgin, who just goes out and is beguiled by the beauty of a girl, and he wants to get married so badly, and he gets married, and it turns out they're like oil and water, and they just can't get along, and the whole thing implodes. Now, admittedly, the Bible does not support the notion of young men going out there and getting all this experience before they finally decide on one. Okay, I'll make that clear. That is why, if you really take the biblical pattern, parents who are much more wise and aged are supposed to guide their young men in the appropriate choice of a wife, and likewise toward daughters in the appropriate choice of a husband. Okay, but apparently, this kind of situation where there was the guidance of parents was not happening in Milton's case. So let's continue on. The blow was a heavy one. Being then, we are told, in the full vigor of his manhood, he could ill bear the disappointment, and therefore thought upon a divorce, that he might be free to marry another. But in England of his day, divorce was virtually impossible. Virtually, because many of the Puritan divines took a more liberal attitude than the Anglican priests and agreed to remarry men who were separated from their wives. Since Milton was a pillar of the Puritan faction, which was in the process of winning the Civil War, he sought to make a further breach in the traditional barriers. He dashed off his first pamphlet on divorce almost as soon as he realized that his wife was not coming back, and possibly even before, and elaborated in the second edition in April 1644. These pamphlets were followed by a translation of extracts from Martin Bucer's views on the subject, and a further two which were published in April 1645. If we may simplify the issue drastically, his main plea was for the introduction of divorce for the man only, on the grounds of what would now be called incompatibility of temperament, unquote. Reader's note, very interesting, because this is a similar attitude, although society today, especially in the West, the United States, has gone even more liberal of that. But even historically, even if you go back in history and look at marriage law in the United States, you see that there is this concept of incompatibility that continually arises. It basically recognizes that you have two individuals that are so far afield of each other in terms of religious or political views and so on, that to try to ironclad maintain that marriage is far more harmful to society as a whole and to children than to basically just say, mea culpa, it was a mistake, and let them go forward. Now, the Catholic Church has a solution to this. They have a solution, and their solution is known as they annul the marriage. Okay, they basically say they are so incompatible that it must have been a total mistake for a priest to even bring them together, and therefore it wasn't a real marriage to begin with. And we're going to say that it wasn't a real marriage, therefore we're still on number one, marriage. This is, that's just the way authorities deal with very difficult situations. Continuing on, Milton was well in advance of his time, and his campaign either aroused irate counterblasts or fell on deaf ears. A law was admittedly passed in 1655, but it was authorized divorce only on grounds of adultery, therefore shaping English legislation in this respect for over 300 years. So Milton's way was not, in other words, in 1655, they didn't allow it. They didn't allow just incompatibility to be the reason. It had to be that she was caught sleeping with another man. Then he could be released from her, you see. Uh, it was Milton as it was, Milton and his wife were reconciled in 1645, and naturally enough, he wrote no further on divorce. The immediate incentive for his polemics had been removed, and in any case, he had had his say. But his matrimonial debacle contributed to an upheaval in all his major beliefs, including those on polygamy. Very interesting analysis here, readers note. Because what it's saying is he found himself in such an untenable situation in the prime of his life, having no righteous sexual outlet because his wife had left him, that he began to open his mind to what other alternatives Scripture might allow, even if the clergy didn't allow it, and he wanted to push politically that it might be allowed. Of course, it didn't. But you kind of wonder, his push for divorce must have gotten back to her who had departed from him. And I bet you that it caused such a furor in those families. And this is just Brother Smith kind of analyzing here, but I have a feeling that they basically said to her, look, he's making us look bad as a family. He is threatening to divorce you, young lady. You need to get your butt back to him, and you need to be a proper wife. And it doesn't matter if you can't get along with him. You need to get back to him. I mean, she was only, I think it was 17. Is that what they said? You know, so of course her family probably had a considerable amount of sway on her. But, you know, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, Milton probably knew just by shaking the branches as much as he could, something would fall out. A piece of fruit would fall out, you know, to use that analogy. And yeah, he got her back. He got her back. Okay. Let's see here. They reconciled in 1645. The immediate incentive for his polemics had been removed. In any case, let's see here. Let's go on. The step from divorce to plural marriage was natural enough. Both issues were interlinked to the writings of many of the reformers, such as Bucer. I think this is Bucer. They were, in fact, alternative solutions in many cases, at least for men in the main biblical text, adduced in discussing the two questions were often the same. Thus, the words placed by Milton on the title page of his first tract on divorce would be equally appropriate to his apology for polygamy. Both practices were for him, quote, restored to the good of both sexes from the bondage of common law and other mistakes to the true meaning of Scripture in the law and gospel, unquote. Readers note. So basically, the argument that he's making here is that the introduction of a second wife, if it so be allowed, would destroy this incredible power that is invested in this one wife to so disrupt and make miserable her husband's life, as is seen all over churchianity today, but that the introduction would cause her to lose her incredible power, and she would then have to reconcile a second co-wife, and therefore would be far more apt to make peace with her husband because she had competition, essentially. And it was in line with the law and the gospel, okay? Far more than what the papist wanted. And he added, wherein also are set down the bad consequences of abolishing or condemning that which the law allows, and Christ abolished not. Not only, too, are the texts discussed the same, but any plea for divorce based on Scripture is obliged to lean more heavily on the Old Testament in view of Christ's restrictive statements. The same hold good for polygamy, since the New Testament keeps silence on the subject. But there's not only a general link between the two debates, there is a specific one as well. Ochino, the Italian reformer had written two dialogues on divorce in which he argued fairly openly that divorce should be allowed on grounds of adultery. These essays were the main work in the hands of all the divorcers when an attempt was made in 1653 to insert a divorce clause in the marriage bill before Parliament. And Ochino's writings on the subject were translated into English in 1657. Now it is known that Milton scoured the writings of the reformers for arguments in favor of divorce, and although he never, for reasons which will be discussed below, acknowledged any debt to Ochino, a careful study, none appears to have been made so far, might well reveal a specific influence. In the case of polygamy, there is certainly no doubt on this score. And it should be stressed that Ochino's two dialogues on divorce were immediately preceded by one on polygamy, which also figures in the 1657 English translation. The three essays, in fact, form a group apart. It would have been natural then for Milton, having studied what the Italian writer had to say on divorce, to turn back to examine his views on the related issue of polygamy. A cursory examination reveals that the whole drift of Milton's section on his question on De Doctrina echoes Ochino's argumentation throughout, though ennobling it by sonorous oratory and fortifying its logic. Thus, both writers contend that, such as the father can easily share his love among his children, a husband can be, quote, one flesh, unquote, with each of his wives. There are even specific passages in Milton which repeat the wording of the earlier writer. And, which is perhaps more important, there is no known alternative source from which Milton could have obtained his material. Milton did not read German, whereas he had no difficulty in understanding and absorbing a work existing in a Latin version. The only difference worthy of note is that Milton, writing what was basically a secret document, could be forthright in his polemics. Ochino, who planned to publish his work, was obliged to resort to diverse shifts and stratagems to avoid too direct a challenge to authority. Also, readers note, you have to understand the political climate. The political climate of England at that time was far afield of what Ochino was dealing with, because Ochino was in the midst of papist authority. But in contrast, Milton was not so. There was a civil war going on, and that allowed for his freedom of expression far more than Ochino would have been allowed. So Ochino basically had to keep his arguments on the down low so that he could have he could say, well, that's not what I meant. In other words, this contrast between two characters, it was his way of hiding the argument, which was proponent of polygamy, you see. One can even go a little further and suggest that Milton began to look into Ochino after reading de Bees's refutation of the Italian's views on divorce and polygamy. In De Doctrina, Milton refutes de Bees, and he mentions him too in the last of his pamphlets on divorce. But curiously enough, the one and only reference, a very vague one, to Ochino is in the private Commonplace book, where he notes that the Italian's works, quote, appear to cover polygamy, unquote. The whole problem is certainly complicated by his silence on the part of the poet. Strangely enough, this omission to mention Ochino had been taken by one critic, apparently in all seriousness, as indicating that Milton never knew the man's works. Why, argues this writer, should Milton make no bones about taking of other Italians, such as Sarpi or Peter Vermigli, Peter Martyr, and never breathe a word about Ochino? The answer, of course, is that Sarpi, whom the critic mistakenly believes was a renegade from Rome, and Vermigli did not represent a scandal to the Protestant churches, except insofar as Sarpi was a Catholic priest, though at war with the papacy, whereas Ochino had ended his life as an Anabaptist. Even under the Puritans, the Anabaptists were no more tolerated than they had been by Luther, Calvin, or Zwingli. Readers know, very interesting statement there. In other words, the Anabaptists were so sola scriptura that not even the Protestant reformers liked them. And if I remember correctly, the Anabaptists, I think the Waldensians and some others, I've read some other church history books that seem to indicate that the seventh day Sabbath was practiced among them, and that is what got them in such big trouble, let alone this marriage issue. But it was the 7 day Sabbath that really got them in trouble, and that many of them were wiped out by, and perhaps even with the help of the Protestant fathers. Continuing on, Milton's very silence as to Ochino then is significant. He was deep in trouble with the Presbyterian divines in 1644 for having omitted to submit his first tracts on divorce to the censorship, a battle which was to prompt him to compose his magnificent Areopagitica. It looks like Areopagitica. This is I think it's either an Italian or Latin title here. Areopagitica in 1644 in defense of the freedom of speech. His last divorce tracts even drew down on him the charge that he was an Anabaptist from an irate but lynx-eyed opponent. Let me read that again. That's hilarious. His last divorce tracts even drew down on him the charge that he was an Anabaptist from an irate but lynx-eyed opponent. Small wonder that he talked of his heretical de doctrina only to a handful of close friends, and that he pretended ignorance of Ochino, even in that work. He was running enough risks without also being foolhardy. While Ochino's influence on Milton as regards polygamy is certain, it is by no means confined to that subject. L.A. Wood argued convincingly some 60 years ago that it also extended to Milton's anti-Trinitarian ideas. And there's an echo in Paradise Lost of Ochino's A Tragedy in 1549 in the form of Satan's briefing to Beelzebub. Whatever the merit of Wood's conclusion, there is general agreement that Milton's move towards radicalism in religion and ethics can be placed in the years 1644 and 1645. In other words, it followed hard on the heels of his marriage troubles. His campaign for divorce and his subsequent battle with the censorship could be traced directly back to his wife's desertion in 1643. The latter evolution was a complex process which took place at various levels of consciousness and on many aspects of which Milton comments most sparingly, if at all. Whole libraries and torrents of learning have been devoted to the question. It is therefore somewhat presumptuous to seek to add yet one small pebble to this mountain. All the same, it is tempting, in view of the demonstrable influence of Ochino on Milton's writings on polygamy, to link the poet's further swing from orthodoxy to his reading of Ochino's Anabaptist dialogues, especially as Milton's evolution in his divorce tracts had led him to place increasing emphasis on Old Testament views. And it should be added that there was a strong Anabaptist but unpolygamous movement in England at that time. It is certainly strange that Milton scholars would have almost completely ignored the role of the Italian writer, even going to the length of denying the existence of any link whatever. The only suggestion that there may have been a connection between the two is tucked away in a footnote to the one passage where Milton mentions Ochino's name. Milton, it says engagedly, must have found much in common with Ochino. It is difficult to avoid the conclusion that scholars are still influenced, probably unconsciously, by the views that anything so distasteful as polygamy cannot possibly have any connection with matters of serious learning. Such an inhibition has borne strange fruits in its time, but few so strange as this reluctance to bite deeper into the Milton apple. With the return of the Royalists in 1660, Milton narrowly escaped being hanged and quartered as one of the men held responsible for sending Charles I to the scaffold. Even after the initial burst of vindictiveness and confusion was over, there was, of course, no question of publishing his De Doctrina. It is a miracle that the manuscript ever survived. The poet's last years were inevitably dreary and difficult. He died in 1674, ailing, blind, and disappointed, but at least he disappeared from the scene before polygamy was defended, still by reference to the patriarchs, but by utter unpatriarchal, sensual, and irreligious writers. Reader's note. And it seems like a lot of the people who and these days, remember, the church had so much more of a stranglehold on anything that the modern, reader can hardly comprehend the kinds of trials they went through, and many of them did, simply to highlight a subject that even modern scholars shy away from, even though it has such an incredible relevance to the work of the writer itself. And this is why a book like this is so important, because I had no idea about Napoleon Bonaparte. I had no idea. I mean, I knew about Milton because I had studied that in English literature classes, because I had read his poems, and I said, my goodness, I mean, is he advocating for polygamy here? That thought I remember, decades ago, but that there is an incredible censorship. Never presume that censorship is new. It was in full swing back then. And the thing is, the people, especially the ecclesiastical area, level of people, they simply did not want to deal with scriptural truth. They wanted to jam the square peg of Roman Greco thinking into the round hole of Scripture. And that's what they did. Uh, you know, and if it sheared off Scripture here and there, well, no big deal. They got the job done. Continuing on, the father of his land, and furthering the moral permissiveness ushered in by the Restoration, Charles II was at pains to set a good example. The Elizabethan poet Donne had already anticipated the atmosphere of the 60s when he wrote at the end of the 16th century, and here's a quote: "How happy were our sires in ancient time, who held plurality of love no crime. By them it was accounted charity to stir up race of all indifferently." In a courtier's tribute to Charles' philoprogenitive exploits, another poet, Dryden, captures the spirit of the age in his Absalom and Achitophel. Looks like Absalom and Achitophel, 1681. And here's the quote: "In pious times their priestcraft did begin, before polygamy was made a sin, when men on many multiplied his kind, ere one to one was cursedly confined. When nature prompted, and no law denied, promiscuous use of concubine and bride, the Israel's monarch, after heaven's own heart, his vigorous warmth did variously impart to wives and slaves, and wide at his command scattered his Maker's image through the land." Unquote. But the merry monarch's amours were, as this passage makes clear, strictly extramarital, and his contribution to the literature on polygamy would have been limited to his quotation, but that his queen, Catherine of Braganza, was unable to give him an heir. Her failure to produce offspring precipitated a national crisis, for if Charles died childless, the throne would be occupied by his brother James, who was a Roman Catholic. The Protestant England shuddered at the thought. Charles' official advisers were not backward in suggesting various ways out of the impasse. The Duke of Buckingham, it was alleged, hinted that the Queen should be spirited away to the plantations in the West Indies, whereupon Charles could divorce her for desertion. Others urged that a divorce be obtained by compelling the Queen to retire to a nunnery and take a vow of chastity. Formal moves were in fact twice put forward by the government, brusquely rejected by the king. Some divines, realizing Charles's insuperable aversion to repudiating Catherine, recommended polygamy as a better tactic for obtaining a direct heir to the throne. The project must have been fairly public knowledge, since the English ambassador at Lisbon was asked in December 1667 whether the report had any foundation, and was at a loss what to answer. This whole episode, like so many others in the history of Western polygamy, is buried in out of the way records, and the official account is utterly different from what is to be found in confidential documents. One of the divines in question was Bishop Burnet, who, in his posthumously published History of Our Own Time, dismisses the whole matter with the briefest of mentions. "I knew, I knew, quote unquote, he notes, quote, speculative people could say a great deal in the way of argument for polygamy and divorce, yet these things were so decried that they were rejected by all Christian societies, unquote. Burnet had not been quite so reserved in his findings at the time. Hardly had the relevant section of his history appeared on the bookstalls than a certain B. Higgins, gent, rushed into print in 1727 to accuse the long deceased bishop of bad faith. Higgins claimed that to have seen two papers by Burnet which were given to Charles Minister, the Duke of Lauderdale, in order to afford justification of the wicked design to allow the second marriage. The first of these memoranda examined whether barrenness provided a case for divorce or polygamy. Unfortunately, because it contains some extremely indecent expressions, Higgins is tantalizingly reticent on the contents. Here's another title: The World Must Be Peopled. Around 1616, another group of considerations combined to increase interest in polygamy. This was the concern with increasing the population, a view reflecting the prevailing mercantilist philosophy that a nation's wealth was measured by its manpower and its gold. Most of the writers in this new discipline, which we would now term demography, rejected polygamy as a means to increase the population, but almost without exception, they reveal that cogent arguments were frequently advanced on the opposite side, and that the case for polygamy as a populationist device was taken seriously. The debate was not, of course, a new one, even in King Charles II's age. It went back to at least 1508 when Sir Thomas More wrote his Utopia, a description of an imaginary commonwealth. Even then, there was an obsession with the lack of numbers and with the widespread avoidance of marriage. The Utopians, notes the writer significantly, quote, are the only people in these parts that neither allow of polygamy or divorce, except in the case of adultery, or insufferable perverseness, unquote. Readers know, so probably they would allow divorce if the husband was engaged in faggotry, possibly. Insufferable perverseness. Or I wonder if it would be the other way, if the wife was engaged in lesbianism. That might be the implication there. Continuing on. Over 100 years later, between 1614 and 1618, Sir Francis Bacon in his New Atlantis records that in his ideal state, polygamy is not permitted, even though where population is so much affected, plural marriage is commonly allowed. The picture in the second half of the 17th century is much the same. In 1693, one writer stressed the caution with which most people adventure on the state of matrimony because of the trouble in charge of providing for a family. And polygamy was one of the solutions envisaged to break the impasse. In 1662, Grant refers to irreligious proposals to multiply people by polygamy, quote unquote. While in 1754, the United Kingdom ambassador to Turkey was asked whether, quote, plurality of wives is favorable to the increase of mankind, as it is constantly affirmed to be in the order of nature, unquote. Most demographers felt that polygamy was contrary to the propagation of the human race, but by no means at all. Petty, the founder of demography, was himself by far the most revolutionary mind. In his sweeping program of sexual reform, polygamy is thrown in at the end as a minor item. His most dramatic proposal, written in Latin and unpublished until over 200 years after his death, is that marriage should cease after 40, above which age practically no holds are barred, since 40 was apparently regarded as the upper limit of the reproductive age, but all girls between 16 and 40 should have men, quote unquote. In the same work, he advocates, quote, Californian marriages, unquote, in which 6 men were conjugated to 6 women in order to beget many and well-conditioned children, unquote. And a consideration often neglected by the demographers, quote, for the greater venereal pleasure, unquote. In an equally humane spirit, he urges that, quote, it should be no sin or shame for a woman to bring a child, and that provision should be made for lying in and for keeping the child, unquote. In comparison with these earth-shaking reforms, his, quote, advices, this is actually a title, his advices about American plantation, 1685, might pass almost unnoticed. In these notes, all that he proposes is that, quote, the English may buy Indian girls of under 7 years old and use them as wives, even with polygamy regulated by authority, unquote. That's a very shocking statement, isn't it? And certainly, I could see why it was roundly rejected. Imagine this. English buying Indian girls of under 7 years old and use them as wives that young. That's pedophilia, gross sin. So, goodness, I mean, the problem is that among all the writers who are proponents of basically what Holy Writ allows, as John Milton or I think it was Dryden, what Holy Writ allows, Dryden exclaims in his poem. Uh, uh, the problem is you've got a mixture of wackos and quacks. And inevitably, even when, let's say, you have a community and they basically establish this permission with great, hopefully with great restrictions, many times you don't get the restriction and you have the wackos are a part of it. That's why, it's just Brother Smith's opinion, got to have a good board of elders to kick out the wackos. Got to kick out the husband abusers. You got to kick out the pedophiles. You got to kick out any of these people who are going to be like a cancer and degrade the reputation, because already the reputation is suffering because you've got the papists who are mad at you and the Protestants who are mad at you. So this you see these issues reoccurrent when you read through this material, and something to think about for sure. Okay, so that concludes our reading for today. Next, we're going to have chapter 9, a doctrine daily defended. And that's a doctrine daily defended. And so some of these chapters are shorter, some of them are longer. I try to get through the whole chapter no matter what. And I hope you guys enjoyed this. And put some comments down there. There is so much controversial material. I don't even mind if some guy was a gamer, I guess, came along and put a comment down on my first video. Actually, I like that, even if it was negative. I kind of like it because, at least people are talking about the subject. And, somehow the censorship is not enough to get this material out there because we have this book today. All right, guys. You guys, yeah, bless you and shalom, shalom.